agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by Cleveland area attorney and Republican factotum Jay Carson. Hey, Jay.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
How you doing this morning?
I'm better than a vegan at a Cory Booker luncheon buffet.
Oh, I like that one. That's a good one. Yeah, well, I'm getting by. I am here, and one thing I wanted to say before we get started with our show this week is, while we don't have any new supporters this week, I really want to thank all of our current supporters, as well as to let you know that if you're not currently a supporter and you feel what we do is important and you have a few extra bucks kicking around, we would definitely appreciate your help. This is obviously not a big dollars operation, and so every contribution, whatever size, really does make a big difference to us. And of course, you don't just get our thanks when you support the show. There's all kinds of stuff you can get, like the weekly bonus show that Jay and I'll be doing after this show, and the weekly quick take. Kristen's doing it this week, and a bunch of other things. And to check it all out, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys, or you can go to politicsguys.com/support. Okay, so Jay, I thought we'd start off this week with where probably everyone expects us to start off with the third Democratic presidential. I call them cattle calls, but I guess the debate is the term that we use very loosely. But of course,
sure.
This was the first one that featured all three of the top-tier candidates, Biden, Warren, and Sanders, on the same stage, along with, a bunch of other people trying to break out of the pack. As always, there were a few memorable lines. I got to say, Jay, and I think you'll like this too, my favorite was Joe Biden saying, "Let's be constitutional," in response to Kamala Harris's proposal to limit assault weapons through executive action. I thought, wow, there's a line that Biden, Carson, and Baranowski can all agree on, which is how often.
It's sort of a low bar we're talking about getting over there. But.
Exactly, yeah. But more seriously, to me, it was healthcare that most clearly laid out the divisions, not only between the candidates, but also the larger divisions within the Democratic Party. Of course, we have Biden representing the party's centrist. He believes that Medicare for all is, too much and too expensive, and that we'd be better off building on Obamacare. On the other hand, you have Warren, Sanders, and the more progressive Democrats who feel that now is the time to push for a much more ambitious system. I actually thought that Pete Buttigieg's comment on this was, sort of representative of his trying to find kind of a third lane to occupy. I'll call it the pragmatic progressive lane, which is, I guess, how I like to think of myself. And I kind of like that phrase. But anyway, at one point...
which I would consider an oxymoron. But
well, yeah, exactly. But at one point, Buttigieg said, if we're right as progressives that the public alternative is better, then the American people will figure that out for themselves. And I thought, yeah, I'm down with that. But anyway, what do you think? What did you think about the debate, Jay? What's your takeaway?
I think, look, does this really move the ball or change things one way or another? I think there's an argument that can be made that, except among real policy wonks like yourself, drawing a line between Pete Buttigieg's position on healthcare and Elizabeth Warren's, it's sort of a fine line to draw, right? And a lot of these, I think you're sort of looking at, it's to me, the view it tends to be, and again, this is viewing it not as a Democrat, but as an outsider, that it's sort of Biden and everybody else.
Well, I think,
and everybody is sort of like just scrambling to be that the Biden alternative. As we get down to that.
Okay, I see what you're saying, the Biden alternative, because essentially we have the centrist camp, which is seems to be at this point almost locked up by Biden. Then maybe we have some centrists in the background who sort of hope that Biden will implode or explode, or there'll be some kind of implosion. And then, of course, we have the progressive camp, and right now it seems like Warren ascendant and Sanders sort of hanging in there, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, the race is going to come down to, I think, Biden and somebody else, and
Yeah.
it's just the question of who's going to be that somebody else, and who can jockey themselves far enough up in the progressive wing to be that person.
Yeah.
So to some extent, I mean, I think policy differences don't matter that much. You know what I mean? Because they are sort of slight, at least they seem sort of slight between Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, and there's also the what conservatives like to make fun of, and I will, sort of the bidding war that goes on in these, that each candidate says, well, listen, I'll commit $1 trillion to this, while the next one will commit five. That and then up to Bernie Sanders, who I think his plans are something like 16 trillion for a whole revamp of the U.S. economy.
Except one thing that's different about this, though, is we see, especially in Biden, pushing back hard against that, coming out flat out and saying, this is too expensive. We can't do this. This is too extreme. And so Biden represents kind of a very, a big change from that kind of bidding war. I mean, you're right. Certainly there's some of it on the progressive end, but it's, and I can understand where you would say, well, it's all just, different varieties of awful. But for people on the left, this is a pretty big distinction, I think, to make. But more.
Well, I don't know. I mean, but I'm saying in terms of those that are the progressive wing.
Sure. Okay.
I don't think that. I think that's where the bidding war is going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? If you're into the bidding war mentality, you're not a Biden voter to begin with.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. Though I think progressives would see it not so much as a bidding war, but as just kind of a move toward a system of greater equality and social justice and so forth. And that means maybe raising taxes and putting more than a few more restrictions on those that have to help out.
But imagine how much more social justice you can get for an extra for $5 trillion more than the other guy. Other guys.
And you say that obviously jokingly, but I think that's an important point to make in a real sense. But again, I agree with you more broadly that we're unlikely to see a whole lot of movement. There are 9 more debates to go, I think, and 5 of those, I believe, happen. Yeah. 5 of those, though, happen before the Iowa caucuses on, I think it's February 3rd. And that, to me, that's going to be the thing. If anything moves the needle, it's going to be Iowa and then New Hampshire, and we'll see about that. But I don't necessarily expect big things. There were a couple of other points that I wanted to bring out. First off, about that division within the Democratic Party. I read something interesting and you wouldn't have seen this in Vox, of all places, which I would hardly call the beating heartbeat of the center left. But they essentially made the argument that, most Democrats are, according to polling, are much more moderate than Sanders or Warren. And they don't really want a lot of the stuff that Sanders or Warren is saying. And so, that needs to be considered in moving forward on this. And I thought, wow, Vox is saying that. Of course, that's what I've been saying all along. And so it's weird.
Well, I've been thinking that too.
Yeah. But also, I wanted to point out, I think one of the big lines was O'Rourke. He not only did he call Donald Trump a white supremacist, but he said, hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15s and AK-57s. And the sound you heard after that was of almost every centrist Democrat in the country smacking his head, saying, oh, God, what in the world did you just do? Right. And I'm sure that was, I'm sure you heard that. It's like, yes, finally. Yeah, they're finally being honest about what they're going to do. Right.
Yeah, no, and I think that's again the problem that the Democrats are going to have going forward is you've got I guess what will happen eventually is Biden will be sort of called upon to disavow that, right? To reassure folks if he's going to be the nominee. But a couple more things about Biden that I think are a little bit is troubling is there were some more sort of goofy sort of Bidenisms.
Record player? You think about the record player?
Well, the record player. But the record player, that can be sort of forgiven, and that's kind of like that's almost kind of quaint, old fat. You know what I mean? It's almost endearing. But the nobody should be in jail for a nonviolent crime. To which Paul Manafort said, "Here, here." But also we didn't lock people up in cages and didn't separate families in the Obama administration, when in fact they did. And the part of this is, of course, that he's getting this, getting the flack from the left. The right doesn't even have to do anything on it.
No, I mean, you're right on that. In that, Joe Biden, of course, wants to have it both ways. He wants to take credit for all the successes, but whenever someone pushes back, says, "Well, I was just the vice president. What was I supposed to do?"
I don't know what this guy said. Yeah,
yeah.
I really knew the guy,
when he was asked directly about that, he said he stands behind everything. But of course, as a strategy, both rhetorical and campaign, of course, that's the approach you're going to take. And so I get that. But, all the other thing about Biden, of course, Castro tried to attack Biden on age, and it seemed to fall almost entirely flat. And I really think both the Castro thing and the Aurora.
Did you remember what you said 2 minutes ago or something like that?
Yeah, exactly.
Again,
and Castro was the one.
The double standard. If that had ever happened, a Republican making that kind of comment, the media would be aghast with the blatant ageism and so forth. But,
well, no, but that was what happened in this case. In fact, a lot of people said that it was absolutely. I don't know. Maybe it didn't come up in the Wall Street Journal, but absolutely, in a lot of the mainstream media, was said that Castro was the one who was in the wrong. His comment was actually off base, and he was the one who didn't seem to understand it. So it looked like he was just simply looking for an opportunity to slide in a cheap shot about age. And so there was a lot of pushback on that. And to me, this kind of gets back to my argument that you have people like O'Rourke and Castro who are just hanging out in the low single digits, and they're trying to do anything. And this is the kind of stuff that happens. And I think what ends up happening is it potentially damages the party and the nominee, because they are laboring under the delusion that they still have a shot at the nomination, which I think I just don't see that happening. Honestly, I think right now there are maybe 5 people with anything approaching a shot. I mean, obviously you have Biden, Sanders, Warren, and then you can say, well, maybe lightning strikes and we have Harris, Booker, and maybe Buttigieg, but maybe that's my hope more than my analysis. But essentially, after that, the rest of them, they might as well just jockey for vice president or try to, set up their, CNN or MSNBC consultantships or what have you, because it's just not going to happen for them. And, you have Andrew Yang saying, I'm going to give doing this weird giveaway program, $1,000 if you send in your story. That's just crazy talk, obviously.
Well, and that sort of goes to a question I was going to ask you. I mean, to what extent do you think all these folks really think they're in the race to be the nominee, and to what extent are they just jockeying for something else?
Well, I think
because I know in Republican fights, I mean, lots of times there is sort of the sense of, you're floating trial balloons and you're just trying to get your name out there, and maybe you get tapped for a cabinet position or something else. But
I think that there are enough people in the race who have taken their understandable concerns about Joe Biden's age and slip-ups and history to sort of argue, at least in their own minds, that, hey, Biden could stumble, and if he does, I can be there to sort of be the person to stand in. I think that's probably Booker's strategy. I certainly think that's Buttigieg's strategy now. It's obviously Klobuchar's strategy. So there are a few people who I think maybe can see things playing out that way, and it's not entirely unreasonable. But for the others, I mean,
Buttigieg, Booker, and Klobuchar also would have, and I'm going to say this, and to be sort of blunt, and probably people will take offense with this, but there's sort of each of them brings a diversity piece to it.
Yeah,
right?
And Harris, I didn't forget to mention Harris,
Harris.
But yeah.
But that would be hey, and again, it's sort of the irony of we won't vote for this person for the actual presidency, but for the sake of diversity, we'll have them on the ticket, and that sort of thing.
Sure. No, absolutely.
Those have something to bring to a ticket that say a Sanders or a Warren would not, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think you could have any kind of a Biden Sanders or Biden Warren ticket just because of, well, not to say that Warren wouldn't bring diversity as a female, but just that I think there would be the two egos,
Sure.
I don't think you could.
Well, there's a lot of talk about if Biden gets the nomination, maybe Abrams is his vice president, and that obviously brings in, a very popular person in a state that the Democrats would like to pick up, Georgia, and there's the diversity issue and that sort of thing. So, and
how'd she do in that race?
What's that? She came awfully close in a red state, so that's how she did in that race, Jay.
All right.
But a couple other things before we move on is there was one comment that I wanted to get your thoughts on. At one point, Bernie Sanders called Donald Trump the most dangerous president in the history of this country, and I think you can make a reasonable case for that. That's not to say that I think that democracy is getting ready to crumble into authoritarian strongman sort of rule or anything like that. We'll see what happens if Donald Trump loses the election. But what do you think? What do you think about that? I mean, would you say that's a ridiculous thing, or if you kind of
I don't know.
back,
I mean, I'm not sure exactly how is he defining dangerous?
I mean,
in one sense, there's sort of the Cold War dangerous type, right? That this is the guy who's going to push the button and blow up the world. Well, okay, that's one kind of danger. Is it this a danger that we're going to lapse into some sort of authoritarianism? In that case, I would say the better example would be, say, a Woodrow Wilson. But I mean, no, or even, look, FDR, a guy who was, almost, essentially president for life.
So basically Democrats, you're saying, are the dangerous ones.
Well, no, I mean, if you could, you could make an argument that
Nixon.
Look, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus and so.
I'm thinking maybe Nixon, is that madman strategy that they were, and of a foreign policy and
but again, that goes more to like the Cold War type thing of, was he going to start World War III versus is he going to take over the country and somehow destroy our democratic institutions?
Sure. Absolutely.
My sense is that probably there's no one man who's good enough or able to do. I don't mean good enough. I mean skilled enough, powerful enough to do something like that. If there was, I would have to think that the most dangerous president would also have to be one who is exceedingly popular.
Oh, that makes sense. Right? Yeah, that's a good point.
And I don't think Trump is.
No, that's a great point.
That's why I would put like an FDR as a,
I see what you're saying. Yeah, in that sense, yeah, I think you have a point. One other thing before I move on, I asked Trey this the last time he and I did the show together, and I really wanted to ask you before I forget. My long-term memory is not what it used to be. So, which of the Democratic candidates do you think would be toughest for Donald Trump to beat, and which do you think would make the least bad president?
Joe Biden.
Okay, for both of those questions, I kind of thought that would be your answer, and so yeah, I think I agree with you on both of those.
That's not an endorsement, mind you. But
I'm still a little torn. I mean, I've raised my concerns about Joe Biden before, and there are a lot of things about Pete Buttigieg and Cory Booker that I quite like. But yeah. Anyway,
and I'm also going to qualify this a little bit by saying, the president, the who the president is important. The people the president brings with him and surrounds himself are almost equally more important, or equally, if not more important.
Great point.
So, I mean, I could live with a Biden flubbing things and maybe be not quite as sharp as he may have been in his youth, provided he's got a solid bunch of centrist people who just want to keep the economy humming and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
absolutely.
As opposed to someone who's coming in with a idea of socialist remaking of the country.
I'm with you on that. Yeah. All right. Well, we will definitely be revisiting this. I think the next debate is mid-October, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that one as well. So anyway, moving on, it was a big week for immigration policy. At the beginning of the week, federal judge Stephen Tigar reimposed a nationwide injunction on the Trump administration's asylum law regulation. That's the one that automatically denies asylum in the U.S. to any applicants who've passed through a third country without applying for asylum there. But that ban was overturned by the Ninth Circuit, which said that it could only apply to states that fell within the Ninth Circuit. But
Correct.
Tegar then reimposed a nationwide ban on Monday, and he based that on the Ninth Circuit's language that groups bringing suit against the asylum change hadn't provided enough evidence to warrant a nationwide ban. He obviously concluded at this point that they had. But then the Trump administration asked the Supreme Court to rule on this directly, which bypassed the normal process of having the Ninth Circuit rule first, and that's something we've seen more than a few times from the Trump administration. And then the court, in a short, unsigned order, overturned the injunction in its entirety. Now, before we go any further on this, Jay, you're the attorney here, obviously, and even though you've explained this before when this has happened in other cases, I thought it would be good to just kind of go over this again briefly. Can you remind everyone of what this sort of action does and doesn't mean?
Sure. The way injunctions work is that typically you put together your suit or your claim, saying that in this case, this policy is somehow unconstitutional, flawed, however, whatever the legal deficiencies of the policy are, and you say, and in this case, we're eventually going to have a decision on the merits, a trial and evidence and so forth, but the issue is such that if the court does not step in and stop this from going into effect, there will be parties who will suffer irreparable harm. And it also, that what you need to show is that you have a high likelihood of success on the merits. And there are some other findings about how third parties won't be harmed, and it's sort of in the public interest to do this. So you go in and seek the injunction sort of on day one and say, look, court, we're going to get to this on a full hearing on the merits, but right now we need you to put a stop to whatever this is, whatever this policy is. So an injunction hearing, the hearings for injunctive relief are necessarily sort of like truncated, sort of quick mini trials almost, right? It's not a full hearing of the case, and the court is looking at, one, are there going to be irreparable harm to someone? And two, is there a high likelihood of success on the merits, such that they can, they feel they safe enough, to go ahead and issue this prejudgment relief, as it were,
right,
pending a final determination on the merits. So that's what you have to show. And then what happened, of course, in this case was Judge Tegar had issued this nationwide. Now, I should also say, typically the way that injunctions work and courts work in general is you've got jurisdiction over your jurisdiction, right? Meaning Judge Tegar is a judge of the Southern District of California, so his orders would take effect and rule or govern over the Southern District of California.
right.
He would not ideally be able to issue orders for places like Texas and other places and the whole country. Now, there are situations where there can be nationwide injunctions, but their showing needs to be sort of higher, and there's sort of a sense of that this is the only way that the parties can have relief is if it's a nationwide injunction.
Right.
That somehow anything less would be inadequate relief for the parties.
Yeah, and I just want to say the reason I wanted you to go over this because there's been a lot of what I guess would characterize sort of as misreporting. I mean, Vox's headline on this was Trump's win at the Supreme Court is a devastating blow to the U.S. asylum system. And I thought, well, wait a second. They just removed an injunction. And so we haven't even heard anything on the merits. And I just wanted to remind people of that.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that's interesting about this, of course, originally went then to the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit affirmed as to the injunction as to California.
Right.
Or to that district, saying, yeah, that's fine. But then said, but look, we don't see that, there's an alleged harm that justifies this nationwide injunction.
Right.
And it's actually, so they sort of, I mean, I'd have to look back at the opinion where they actually remanded it, but essentially there was the message to Judge Tegar, well, look, you didn't show your work, right? As far as the nationwide injunction, failed to discuss the alleged harm. So then he came back and sort of did the do-over, saying, "Well, the nationwide harm that I see is some of these agencies or groups that help refugees, asylum seekers, would have to redesign the templates for their forms and that sort of thing." Which, again, the Supreme Court apparently was just not buying as being irreparable harm.
Right. And I think the argument of irreparable harm might be that, well, while people are waiting or people who can't apply for asylum in the United States are in some pretty bad, potentially, situations in Mexico. And there have been a lot of reports, of course, of, about crime and gangs and all that sort of thing. And so those people would, you could argue, suffer irreparable harm. But that clearly was not an argument.
But they're not the plaintiffs.
Ah, okay, gotcha. Okay, that's a good point. So that's because it's the plaintiff. Okay,
yeah, because in this case,
great point.
The plaintiffs, or it's brought by. Now, I shouldn't say that. I mean, there may have been folks who've jumped on, but the suit was mainly brought by immigrant rights asylum seeker groups that essentially were saying, "Look, listen, we can't perform our mission." Because this, so
that's a great point, and this is why one of the many occasions why I'm glad that you're an attorney. Anyway, now there was a dissent. 2 justices signed on to it. It was written by Justice Sotomayor and joined by Justice Ginsburg. And Jay, there was one particular part of the dissent that I wanted to get your take on. Sotomayor wrote, "The court sidesteps the ordinary judicial process to allow the government to implement a rule that bypassed the ordinary rulemaking process." What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, that's sort of I think maybe jumping a little bit ahead on the merits, right? And
because I think her point
here.
I
guess her point is it should have gone to the Ninth Circuit again before it came to the Supreme Court. And I'm not entirely unsympathetic to that argument, right? But there is also something to the effect that I think the Supreme Court needed to say something about nationwide injunctions to get the message out, and I think they did so appropriately in this sort of, there wasn't really an opinion, a majority opinion. It was just a stay granted,
right?
With a dissent. So I mean, we would assume that this is a 7-2 decision. And again, the decision itself didn't really go to the merits. Now, look, it is unusual to leapfrog that directly to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court, at least 7 justices, apparently felt it was significant enough that it merited their attention.
Although
because they could have easily said, "Look, we're not going to take this. Go to the Ninth District. Go to Ninth Circuit."
Although we don't necessarily know that it was 7 justices who agreed with that. All we know is that there were only 2 justices who signed on to that dissent.
who were mad, who disagreed enough to dissent. Yeah.
Now, the other part of Sotomayor's comment there, or writing there, was talked about the rulemaking process. That kind of gets into the merits of the case, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Now, here's my analysis. It seems to me that what the Trump administration is trying to do here with this rule actually does fall outside of its legitimate executive authority. And here's why I think this. If you look at the Refugee Act of 1980, which is kind of the legislation that sort of is behind this, it says that any non-citizen in the U.S. can apply for asylum whether or not at a designated port of arrival and irrespective of immigration status. The only exceptions are listed here are for those who were firmly resettled in another country before they came to the U.S., or if they pass through another country that we have a safe third country agreement with. And that's where another country agrees that refugees or asylum seekers will apply for asylum, refuge in that country they go through first, and not where they ultimately want to be, presumably. And we have a safe third country agreement with Canada. We don't have one with Mexico, though the Trump administration has been pressuring Mexico to enter into one. And so based on this, my conclusion is that the Trump administration is once again trying to bypass the legitimate process, which in this case would mean either A, entering into a safe third-party agreement with Mexico, or B, getting Congress to amend the Refugee Act and just trying to basically make it so through executive fiat. And so that to me is pretty clearly overreach on the part of the executive. What do you think?
I think that's a good argument. I don't know whether I'd go all in on that at this point, but I would say no. That's a good argument that, look, this is not authorized by the statute, and you cannot fairly find this sort of in sort of the, I don't know, the penumbra, of the statute that would allow for some executive interpretation or rewriting of the rule. That said, I mean, I think there might be, I think there's some wiggle room, right? I mean, because agencies get a lot of deference.
Sure, there often is.
And especially the executive gets a lot of deference in foreign policy.
Right.
So I think there's some wiggle room there. So I'm not going to make the call now and look, haven't read the briefs or anything like that.
Sure.
But no, I think that's a legitimate argument. And I mean, where I come from on this is that we're better being governed by legislative action than the administrative executive action.
Yep.
On these sort of fundamental policy questions.
Absolutely, and I'm right with you on that for sure. So yeah. All right, well, moving on. This week, John Bolton either, I guess, resigned or was fired, depending on who's telling the story, as President Trump's national security advisor. Bolton, who, of course, for decades has been one of the hawkiest of hawks, he clashed not only with Donald Trump, but also with I guess really pretty much everyone else in the administration, but maybe most notably Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And Bolton, who took the job in April of 2018, was Trump's third national security advisor following H.R. McMaster, and before him, the very brief tenure of Michael Flynn.
Short-lived.
Yeah, who is currently awaiting sentencing, which is never a phrase your administration wants to hear in relationship to, even past officials. So, Jay, what do you think?
Mike, I think no one convicted of a violent crime should be in jail.
There you go. Yeah.
So there, he could wait for a pardon President Biden.
Exactly. So what do you think about Bolton being? I mean, what's it mean? Do you think, if anything, for President Trump's foreign policy?
I think this actually threw a wrench. This upset a lot of your typical conservative, especially neoconservative type folks. I mean, Bolton was kind of the neoconservative dream.
Yeah.
For this post, in that he was a believer in a strong, aggressive U.S. foreign policy, a outward-faced foreign policy, and I think he was sort of a no-nonsense, clear-headed type, tough guy. And you think on the one hand that this ought to be exactly the type of person that Trump is looking for, although Trump would be more isolationist, or I should maybe the better way to put it is less interventionist than say Bolton would be apt to be. But yeah. I think a lot of Republicans looked at this as a loss of, and you can like Bolton or don't, and I know you don't, but as a loss of some expertise, and also the idea that if Trump was running this as sort of this team of rivals thing where he values all these, inputs and whether he agrees with them or not, it seems to take a dissenting voice out of the room. And then the other piece of this is the topics that, at least what we've heard on, is the the invitation for the Taliban to come to Camp David, which I think even you'd agree. I think you'd say that, my God, Bolton got it right on that one.
Yeah,
right.
But on the other hand, if he did in fact leak information about the meeting, so which some people claim, and of course he denies,
sure,
that you find out that your national security advisor is leaking, well, then your national security advisor has to go. I mean, it's that simple, I think.
Absolutely. No,
but I think even for people who agree with Bolton on policy, and I certainly don't, as you pointed out, he was maybe the wrong person just because he's such an annoying guy. He doesn't play well with others. He's always been this kind of hyper-aggressive, self-promoting, abrasive sort of person. And so, in a way, he's designed to not, put forward those kind of goals because he can't get along, can't convince people. He's not very diplomatic, certainly. And I think from a lot of accounts that Donald Trump liked him because he heard him on Fox News, kind of vociferously arguing for Trump and that sort of thing. And obviously, that's a bad way to pick your people. But you take a look at, say, the guy who preceded him, H.R. McMaster, very different sort of guy. I mean, in a lot of ways, John Bolton was like Donald Trump. It's like he has some ideas in his head and he goes forward. He doesn't want to listen to anyone else. He just kind of plow right through anything. I would argue that's the last thing that Donald Trump needs. He needs more people like McMaster and fewer people like Bolton. And there, by some accounts, Bolton worked very hard to basically tell Donald Trump, you don't really need a national security team. Just kind of listen to me and we'll just do our thing together and that'll be good. And of course, there's a reason why we have a national security system and not just some guy who talks to the president, and the larger concern here is that we dismantle this system, at least under Trump, because the president feels like, I got this, it's fine. And that's definitely what we don't want.
Well, I would say that the system is pretty big, so I don't think it's going to be dismantled by
and that's maybe
one guy. Yeah.
But the president can short circuit the system, I guess. Maybe
exactly. The president can say, "I'm not going to listen to everything else is going on. I'm just going to listen to this one guy." And whether Bolton listens to the people who report to him or not, that's another question. But I would say Bolton is also someone who would probably have found a home in most any Republican administration's foreign policy shop, right? I mean, I think if you had I'd like to think a Kasich
administration would not have given him a home.
I don't know.
I'd like to think so.
But let's put it this way. I mean, I think I don't think it's certainly not surprising that, look, if he were to occupy some sort of important foreign policy role, and I guess it's seen as this was someone that, again, you can agree with John Bolton or disagree, but you know where he's coming from, and he represents a distinctive point of view. And sometimes that in foreign policy is good to have that sort of clarity and the look. Here's what we're about. Here's where we're coming from. That clarity.
Yeah, and it's not
as opposed to the Trumpian sort of, well, you just never know what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
Be off balance.
Yeah. Well, and it's not like Mike Pompeo, Bolton's main kind of foil in this is any kind of a dove or anything like that. Right. It's just that
it does sound like it was less ideological and more just personality driven.
Yeah, to a certain extent. Yeah, without a doubt. And I think this gets back to a point.
I mean, here's the thing. But what are you going to do though? If you know that. If the president's saying, hey, I think it's a really good idea to invite the Taliban to Camp David the week of 9/11.
Well, you don't leak it. You don't leak it. You mention,
and we don't know that he did.
No, that's true. What you do.
The understanding is that he offered to resign.
Yeah, and
Trump said we'll talk about it tomorrow. Yeah, and then Trump said he's fired.
and who knows? Yeah, what happened there? But this gets back, I think, to a point you made earlier in the show. Now, it's pretty clear that Donald Trump is just not a policy guy. And that can actually be, you talked about this, I think, in relation to Biden, in a sense. That's not necessarily fatal or even all that bad.
Right. If you have the right people around you.
You need the right people, you need the right systems around you, because the job is way too big for one guy going by his gut, no matter how smart that person is. And I think you agree with that. So, all right. Moving on. North Carolina, voters went to the polls this week to elect 2 members of the House of Representatives in special elections for the 3rd and 9th congressional district. Now, nobody expected the 3rd district race to be close, and it wasn't. Republican Greg Murphy kind of cruised to victory. He beat Alan Thomas by over 24%. But it was the 9th district race where most of the interest was, including that of, President Trump, who, along with Vice President Pence, made last-minute appeals to North Carolina voters to elect Republican Dan Bishop. And Bishop did win, but by just over 2% in a state that went for Trump by 12% in 2016. So, Jay, what, if anything, do you think this might tell us about 2020, which is kind of what we're all looking for now at this point?
I think not a ton, you know, and I know this was looked at as, this is going to be the big bellwether and so forth. I'm still a believer that all elections are local. at their heart. And I think this is probably a mirror of what that district is, right? It's not too far off from what the result was in the last election, which there were
I mean,
shenanigans.
2018, yeah, right.
2018,
right,
yeah, there were shenanigans that then caused the winner to have to withdraw, and then the special election. But it's likely those shenanigans did not impact the race all that much, and I think we probably end up with sort of the same place we were last time.
And by shenanigans, you mean like vote fraud, I think, right?
Yes,
Isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, just to be clear.
So,
a couple of things, and I think you've mentioned this before when we've talked about other special elections, is oftentimes it's dangerous to draw conclusions because special elections are, well, special. One thing that wasn't mentioned in a lot of media accounts, I was surprised. I really had to dig for this. Ended up going to the North Carolina Secretary of State site. Turnout was just over 25%. Which, if you look back in 2018,
is good for a special election.
Yeah, but it's still much lower than a regular election. In 2018 election, turnout was more than double that. It was almost 53%. Yeah. Not only that, if you look at the spending and the attention, very, very different. Total spending in this race was around $20 million, which would make it one of the most expensive special elections in U.S. history. And you can have these situations where, for instance, right at the end, the president, the vice president, say can go there because it's the only race. But when you're talking about, 435 races, not all those competitive, but if you're talking about, maybe a dozen, 2 dozen competitive races, that's not the case for either party. And so while I am reluctant to draw any big conclusions, I will say, as a centrist Democrat, I see this as a positive sign for centrist Democrats because that's what McCready is. I mean, He's a centrist who nearly picked off a conservative in a solidly red district, and he totally crushed it in suburban areas. He did even better than he did in 2018, but the big difference was the rural vote, which came through for Bishop. And it seems like there's a lot of polling that's suggesting that this is part of a larger trend as Democrats are doing better and better not just in the urban areas, but in the suburban areas. And it's much bigger rural turnout that's really helping a lot of Republican candidates. And it's probably what's going to, what President Trump is pinning his hopes of re-election on to a certain extent. But I think probably the best analysis of this, at least my favorite one certainly, came from Republican pollster Frank Luntz. He tweeted, conservative Twitter celebrating a 2-point win in a plus 12 GOP district from 2016 is like Michigan celebrating a win over Army in double overtime. And I thought that that about nailed it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I am hopeful for 2020. I think that there's a good chance that Democrats will expand on their majority in the House, and this is just one thing that kind of points me in that direction. Any other thoughts, Jay?
No, I mean, again, other than I'm always reluctant to draw conclusions from a special election because, like you said, they're special, and
also I should say that I am cognizant of the fact that the conclusion I am drawing is also the conclusion I would like to draw, and that gives me pause, and I think it should. So, but we shall see. All right, our final story today. The Food and Drug Administration this week moved to at least temporarily ban flavored e-cigarettes. Now, this, of course, comes in the wake of hundreds of reports of vaping-related lung illnesses, though I think we should point out that most of these involve cannabis, at least at this point. Right. HHS Secretary Alex Azar said that the administration plans to clear the market of flavored e-cigarettes. Now, this isn't actually an all-out complete ban. I should explain. The FDA only got the authority to regulate tobacco products in 2009, and this was under the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act. They extended this authority to e-cigarettes in 2016, but they allowed existing e-cigarettes to stay on the market pending FDA approval, and this is what's called enforcement discretion. Now, they set the approval deadline for all these e-cigarette products was initially 2018. But Scott Gottlieb, who was the FDA commissioner at the time, pushed it back to 2022 because at that point, it actually seemed like e-cigarettes might be a good way to help smokers move to a potentially less harmful alternative, which you can make that argument. But then complaints, about companies like Juul that had massive growth, which, in part was based on, it seemed like indirect, at least targeting, and some direct targeting of kids through fruity flavors and campaigns and that sort of thing. So then the FDA says, oh, maybe we should reconsider this. They moved the approval deadline back to 2021 or up to 2021. Then a federal judge moved it up even further to May of 2020. So right now, companies like Juul can still potentially have their non-tobacco flavored e-cigarettes approved, but until they are, they'll be off the market under this move by the FDA. Jay, what's your take on all this?
I'm not crazy about the government sort of jumping in and knocking out an entire industry. It's an industry that do I particularly care for? No. Based on these health issues that appear to be, as you said, in the majority related to sort of black market, as it were, THC products, as opposed to the standard vaping nicotine type products. And again, it's sort of there's a little bit of a disconnect, right? We're saying that on the one hand, it's these lung illnesses that are the reason we have to do this, but also we don't want kids to do the flavored stuff. Which again, those are both two good reasons, but they're not the same reason, if you know what I mean, right? Well, and I would say the one would justify sort of immediate emergency action and shutting down an industry. The other would seem not to.
But just to be clear, the FDA does have the legal authority to do this. They just have chosen since 2016 to not exercise their authority, because these e-cigarette products are unregulated products that require under law this approval by the FDA. So they're unapproved products that require FDA approval, and they don't have it, but the FDA decided back in 2016, well, we'll just leave the market alone. I think making the cost-benefit analysis saying that, well, the benefits of allowing adults to get off of, regular cigarettes outweigh any potential harms. But then as we saw the youth vaping thing, which has just gone through the roof, they said, well, wait a second, we need to reinvestigate this cost-benefit, and maybe we should not have as much enforcement discretion and just start enforcing this regulation as it's on the books.
Right. No, I'm not arguing the authority.
Right. Okay.
To do that. I'm arguing the wisdom of it.
Interesting. At the same time, this week the FDA cited Juul for promoting its e-cigarettes as less harmful than regular cigarettes, as I think they called it a mitigated risk product, which they can't legally do without FDA approval. And of course, the sort of irony here is that the reason I think the FDA pushed back the approval guideline is because they actually felt that they're probably less harmful, at least to current smokers.
Right. It's not the combustion that you get with cigarettes and carbon monoxide and all that kind of stuff too.
And actually, if you go on Juul's website, they are extraordinarily careful to not make anything that's a health claim. They go right around the edge there and just kind of, skirt that. But apparently this relates to what some of their marketing people have said in talks and so forth, like, oh yeah, we're much less harmful and FDA is going to approve it any day now, that kind of thing. And it turns out some people have phones and things can be recorded, and, you don't want to really be doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, although I'm looking for the article right now, I should have had it teed up earlier, but there was and maybe one of our listeners could help us, but that I understood that some of the major manufacturers like Juul had already pulled the flavored packets from general circulation, right? You couldn't just go in and buy one; you had to buy it online, and there was some sort of age test. Now that I don't know how rigorous that is. It's sort of like, are you 18? Okay, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But as I understood it, that some of the bigger companies weren't selling those, retail over the counter anymore anyway.
But I think if you look at it from the point of view of a company like Juul, which didn't exist even just like a few years ago, practically, right?
Right.
When they're looking at where their growth is, their growth, their business model is not going to be terrifically successful on trying to get a small percentage of current regular cigarette smokers to switch over to their thing. I mean, much of their growth has been in youth vaping. They know that, and I think
Sure.
When they're talking amongst themselves, I would find it hard to believe that they're not saying, well, how can we stay within the letter of the law, but allow the kids to do their vaping?
Well, there's also a question of, again, you get into some fine line drawing, because you can say, well, Budweiser's growth, they're sort of, are they looking at kids who are just turning 21, or are they looking at kids who are 17, 18, right, to market their product to? They would certainly say, no, we want everyone to drink responsibly, and once they're the legal age. And I think Juul could make the same argument that, are we trying to get, 14, 15-year-olds to do this? No. Are we trying to get 18, 19-year-olds? Sure.
I want to make two distinctions here, I think. Number one is that I think it's harder to make a case that there's anything that's not sort of inherently negative or harmful about inhaling or ingesting nicotine in any way. And I think that's a difference from alcohol. But secondly, is the addictive properties. From what I understand, in a lot of cases, what these companies have done has been to ramp up the nicotine levels so they can get people hooked. And that's a very different thing than with alcohol. So, I'm not dismissing your analogy entirely, but I think that tobacco or nicotine type products are a different thing, and it's more easy for companies to manipulate and get people kind of hooked in a way that's certainly not impossible, but more difficult for alcohol companies.
No, I think it's a fair argument. Okay. But then where that argument collapses, though, is the flavored part of it, right? If you're hooked on the nicotine, does the flavor matter that much? And I think you would then say, well, you get the flavor to get them to try the first time, then they're hooked, and it doesn't matter what flavor they get after that.
Exactly.
But
and of course,
I also, my sense would be if if you are an adult purchasing what is a legal product, albeit a legal product that's not good for you, one that you probably shouldn't use, is a, if adults want to have the mint flavor or mango flavor or something like that, who's the government to say, no, we insist that you have the flavor that doesn't taste good.
Yeah.
It's almost like, look, you can argue that, I guess it's a different argument for, say, beer with a lower alcohol level, but say Scotch, right? A higher alcohol whiskey type thing. People would argue that there were very few, if any, health benefits to having hard liquor every day, as opposed to a glass of red wine or something. But would that justify we're gonna make it taste bad? It just.
Well, it's not making it taste bad. It's what's added to it to make it particularly enticing, which is
right.
Different. If you had mango flavored, gin or something like that, and you kind of say, hey, kids. But, there are, in fact, you mentioned the government, saying, well, you can't have this. This has been, we've seen Michigan, for instance, last week became the first state to ban almost all cigarettes. And I believe in New York, Governor Cuomo said he's going to introduce the bill to ban flavored e-cigarettes. And so we're seeing more of this, I think, as initially it seemed like vaping was this annoying, if kind of, not necessarily dangerous alternative to smoking. But now, as we're getting a little more evidence, it seems like, well, maybe not so much. And this is why I think a lot of people on the left, including myself, say this is why we have regulatory agencies. And this is why it was probably a mistake in the first place for the FDA to allow this, have this discretion and just say, well, we'll let you market these things while we figure out if they're okay or not. That's just not a good approach, I don't think.
What's and I know we're probably running late on time, but just sort of the funny juxtaposition of this of governments stepping in to try to ban both federal and state vaping and e-cigarettes, while at the same time expanding marijuana access.
Well, I think that's because
I think it's a funny sort of, and again, especially when it looks like the vaping illnesses seem to be related, at least at this point, to THC.
Well, I think in that instance, the argument is that there are arguably some medical benefits to marijuana. In fact, I think a majority of the states that have legalized marijuana, including Ohio, have done it on for medical reasons, whereas medical nicotine is not a thing. Would be my argument.
Okay.
But
All
of
right.
course, then there are
All right.
states, like California and Denver, where you can just kind of light up, whenever, however, not
Well,
for
and
any
then there's
particular
also
medical reason.
then hemp legalization, which is something else, and we could have a whole discussion on that
Sure.
someday about how the hemp legalization laws in many states, including Ohio, have, at least for the time, essentially legalized all marijuana. So, but
Well, I mean, not for smoking and kind of that sort of use.
well, but it's created a system where you're unable to prosecute it.
Oh, okay. Well, that's
Yeah.
now. See, you're kind of leaving everyone dangling on that.
Tune into the bonus show, and I'll explain why.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah. In fact, we are running a little long. That's okay, but we are going to do more. So as soon as Jay and I are done recording this show in just a minute, we are going to be doing that bonus show. And Jay, if you wouldn't mind expanding on that, I hadn't planned on that, but I think that would be really kind of interesting to hear a little bit more about. And maybe we can also talk about, I don't know, the Trump administration finally releasing aid to Ukraine after both Republicans and Democrats said, hey, let's get this going. So also, if you're a supporter at the $5 per month and above level, Kristen has a Politics Guys quick take for you, and we'll have all that ready by the time you hear this. And if you're interested in getting access to all that, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys, or you can go to politicsguys.com/support. If you want to get in touch with us, we're at mail@politicsguys.com. There's our Facebook page, always stuff going on there. Facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. And if you haven't subscribed to the show already, we would really appreciate it if you could do that. That helps us out. And if you let other people know, that would be great as well. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Benji Fishman, and Andra Masker. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.